guys, welcome to the Plantae divisions lesson for Eileen Chevalier's Typewriter Aalphabet flashcards. These guys right here. So all the plants in the Typewriter Aalphabet are in the division called Angiospermi. In this lesson, we're going to find out how to tell if a plant is part of the Angiospermi division and learn more about the plants that aren't. We're going to spend almost all the rest of our time thinking about angiosperms. So today we're going to look at the plants that aren't in that division. First thing we're going to do is get our materials, just like always. So under the read section, today you are going to use the natural history book. And of course, you will want your flashcards handy. So J is our flashcard for today. And to start off, we're going to do some definitions. So pull out your journal and I will read some definitions to you and you can write them down. Angiospermi, division of the Plantae kingdom containing all flowering plants. Angiospermaphyta is the phylum of the Plantae kingdom containing all flowering plants. So if the definition of these two words is the same, what does that mean about these two words? It's kind of like a math problem. These two words are equivalent to one another, and it's a little confusing. So I wanted to make sure that you understand botany is a little different than when you study animals. The classification system is just, there are idiosyncrasies in botany that aren't there. And so if you studied animals a lot in the scientific classification system, or if you just learned kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, family, species, then what you learned was phylum. But no one uses that in plants. So like whenever you look at botany books, what you're going to see is you're never going to see phylum. And so it'll be really confusing to you if you don't know how these two things are related. So there is a word, Angiospermaphyta, which is the phylum, so phyta, phylum. But really Angiospermi is the one that people use. So, and it's called a division. So if you look in the plants section here of the natural history book, then you will see the difference between these two things. So let's just look at the first page. So this is Liverworts. So if you look at this page, it's so wonderful. I love this book because it gives such great examples of everything. So if you look right here, whenever they talk about plants, they tell you how, like the entire spectrum. And these, at the beginning, they'll just tell you how many different classes or orders or families there are. But this says division at the very top. So you might just be wondering, like, that's not in the classification system. I didn't learn division. It's the same thing as phylum. So just think kingdom, phylum. With botany, it's kingdom and division. So the kingdom is Plantae, and then the division is this one happens to be Angiospermi. So remember, did you see that phyta at the end? It's the same as the phylum. So now that we've cleared that up, we can go on to our question and investigate section. Angiospermi means covered, angio, seeds, sperm. Is this an easy way to identify angiosperms? What seeds aren't covered and what plants create them? Where in the classification system would these plants be found? So to help us answer this question, I made a chart of the Plantae kingdom. On the left-hand side of this chart are the divisions that reproduce with seeds, and there are 5 of them. And then on the right-hand side of the chart are the divisions that reproduce with spores, and there are only 3 of those. So don't forget, the division in the plant kingdom is the same as a phylum in the animal kingdom. All right, so this is the classification right under a kingdom. So let's look at these on the left that reproduce with seeds. There are 4 at the top, the Psychidophyta, the Gymnosperms, the Gnetophyta, and the Pinophyta, which are the conifers. And all four of those are different types of gymnosperms. Gymno means naked and sperm means seed. And then under that, all by itself, are the Angiospermi. So that's a different division. And the Angiospermi actually includes every single plant that has a flower, that makes seeds inside a flower. And angio means covered, sperm means seed, and the reason that those are covered seeds is because they are made in an ovary, right? So the gymnosperms make seeds as well, but they don't make them inside of an ovary, which is why they're called naked. Only the Angiospermi make their seeds inside an ovary. So the question is, how can we tell the difference between these gymnosperms and the angiosperms? So sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's a lot more difficult. So we'll just look at some easy ones first. So we happen to see liverworts. That's the page I already showed you. And mosses is one of my favorites. I love moss. I used to have tons of moss. It's so beautiful, and it does, I'll show you this picture. Do you see these little things coming up? Those are actually how the moss reproduces. So those are spore capsules, right? So instead of making seeds, it creates spores, but it's a little bit more complicated. So instead of the spores, so you would think like in a flower, you have the male and the female DNA combining within the flower. But the way that the spore works is it releases the spores and then they combine outside of the plant to create another plant. So it's a more complicated process, and it's a different, completely different reproduction mechanism. Then you also have ferns. Ferns are really cool. And there are so many different kinds of ferns. So I'll just read you a little snippet because it's really fascinating. Some ferns are small and easily overlooked. There are some that are so tiny, like super duper tiny. They almost look like moss. They're so small. But the group also includes large tree-like species that can be over 15 feet high. Many are compact plants with a small cluster of fronds, but others have creeping stems that sprout fronds as they grow. So it's just totally different than the Angiospermi. They never make seeds. Again, they make spores. It's really cool. If you see a fern, so this one obviously isn't producing any spores right now because it's the winter and it's inside, but when it's time, when it's ready, you can just see the fern leaf from the top, and then you lift it up and look underneath, and it'll be covered in these little dots. And that is how it's reproducing. So, like, how do you know if a plant is a flowering plant? Like, aloe just looks like there are no flowers most of the time. It's very rare. I've only had one aloe bloom ever. It was amazing. I think it has to do with where I live. It's just not the right climate for them to bloom. So you may have a plant that you think is not an angiosperm because you don't see the flowering there, but it is because it needs certain conditions to bloom. A lot of cacti are very, very persnickety about blooming. This guy blooms all the time, the oxalis. So it's easy to tell that it's an angiospermi. All right, so we have kind of put a bunch of these together on this page. So these are cycads, ginkgos, and genophytes. So that's 3 different phylums, which they call division in botany. A lot of those are like kind of very dry feeling. And then easy way to tell when you're looking at a plant are the conifers. So if there are cones on a plant, then it is not an angiosperm because it is reproducing with cones instead of flowers. Although this is where it gets tricky, right? So if you see the cones, then you're like, I know it's not an angiosperm because it doesn't have a flower, it has a cone. But because they have pollen, just like the flowers, there are other things that are kind of similar and kind of tricky about them. So this is a conifer. And one of them is right here.
Stone.
And it is this, yeah.
Stone pine?
Stone pine. And what does it say under stone pine?
I can't read that, it's too small.
I know, it's too small for me too. But the stone pine is where the pine nuts are produced. So you might have had, what's that delicious?
Pesto.
Pesto. So pesto has pine nuts in it. So if you've ever had pesto, you've had those delicious pine nuts in there. And then we're gonna look at another nut over here. So that is right there. And what is that?
Ripe walnut.
A walnut, right? So we're gonna compare and see if we can tell the difference between these nuts. One is a Pinophyta. So this is our, from a pine tree, just to give you an example. And this is what the nuts look like. So not from this pine cone. This pine cone does not produce nuts like this. So it has to be that special kind of pine that we looked at in the book. And then here are some walnuts. I do not have a walnut tree with us or any of the other things. So we only have just the walnuts. But we'll remember that this one is from an angiosperm. So what do you think? Let's do a taste test and try to see if we can tell from these seeds what the difference is.
Cool.
All right, so
They're very similar.
I do have this pine cone here to show you. And I'm not sure exactly what they look because I've never actually seen one of the stone pines. But you can find sometimes, if you look in here, you can find these seeds. I found some the other day. Did you find one? Anyway, it'd be great if you could find some pine cones and you can peel them apart and see if you can find the seeds in there. So the texture of a pine nut and the texture of, say, I think I marked it in here. So if we come way over here, there are pecans, right? So a pecan is a nut that is an angiosperm. So there is actually a flower that creates a pecan. But if you're eating a pecan or say a walnut or something, and you're eating a pine nut, it is so difficult to tell. I mean, it tastes like the same. I mean, they're so similar. So you're like, well, the plant that this came from, was this an angiosperm or was this a conifer? That is really a difficult process, right? So look, if I eat a berry, definitely came from a flower. If I eat a nut, it might have come from a flower or it might have come from a cone. So it's a little tricky. So I'm gonna just show you, I'm gonna show you in this book how many pages they have for each of these. So this is the section on everything that's not a flowering plant. This is the section on the flowering plants. So just so many more plants in the flowering plants section. So lots of plants are flowering, but there are lots of really large species, like the pines, especially if you live in the southeastern United States. There's tons of pines here. So most of what we see when we look around, not most, but a lot of what we see when we look around are not flowering plants. So depending on where you live, you might see more or less percentage of flowering plants around you. So the flowering ones are the Angiospermi. Next question, how can plants reproduce without seeds? Which plants are able to do that? And are they all part of the same division? These are the 3 divisions that reproduce using spores. The Marcantiophyta, the Bryophyta, and the Pteridophyta are all divisions that reproduce using spores instead of seeds. And the last thing is the journaling activities. So there are 2 for today. The first one is find examples of other divisions, phylums, in the Plantae kingdom. Draw from real life if possible, or use pictures. If you're using this natural history book, there's so many amazing pictures in there. To draw and label examples in your journal. Make sure to include which division each plant is in. Bonus, try to include how it reproduces. Angiosperms are extremely diverse. This is the second one. They range from giant trees to tiny, tender plants that only live for a matter of months. from water dwellers to those in the desert. So they live in the water, they live without almost any water. And their flowers can be so tiny you don't even know they're there, or they can be enormous, 3 feet. Explore the diversity of the Angiospermi division. And a really great place to explore that is in this book. Just kind of like page through, look at all these different pictures. They're not to scale, so the trees will be like this, and then like the single flower will be the same size or even bigger. So just try to remember how big they would be in real life. You can use this book. You can use the alphabet cards. I have a bunch of different kinds on there. Again, the scale is not proportionate. If you use the cards, you'll see some examples like magnolia is a tree and it lives for many, many years. But the bleeding hearts lose their leaves every year. So they're still there, they're just under the ground, but they kind of disappear from sight. Jasmine and wisteria are really long vines. And sunflowers can grow taller than humans, which is really fun. You should grow sunflowers if you haven't. But violets bloom super close to the ground, so where the flower is can change dramatically depending on the plant. So this is a really fun place for you in your journal. Like I said, that you can come back to things in your journal and kind of use it as like a documentation for you. So if you start making, you can do whatever you want. You can make a chart. You can do extremes. You can do, cacti versus water lilies. Like those are two very, very different habitations, right? Habitats for plants. So you could do it that way. You can compare them. You can do like tallest plant, smallest flower, and that sort of thing. Or you can just include that whole diversity in the range. So just have a spot, and then later when you find some really interesting plant, then you can come back and add it into that section on the diversity of plants of Angiospermi. And that's it. Thanks, guys. I hope you enjoy starting these pages in your journal and coming back to them, and that these definitions were really helpful for you today with the divisions and the phylums. It's a little confusing because botany is slightly different than the animals, but it's not too hard. We'll see you next time. Bye, guys.